part of this conversation is about the broader art world. By art world, we extend from the artist who's created to the broader community of folk, like support personnel and other individuals who make their artistic practice happen for us. That's an important part of this conversation. Sometimes we think about the painter and we think about what they might do, but if we're talking about exhibiting the work, now we're talking about a carpenter. And that carpenter also might be a painter or a photographer. I know one, have one in mind. So that said, the broader art world is an important part of the conversation because essentially they make the art happen.
Yeah.
You might have seen this, but 2 years ago, the Regional Arts Commission came out with something called Art Economic Prosperity 6. This is with our partners in Washington, D.C. called Americans with Art. One of the things that we tally is this big number. We say that $868 million has flowed through arts organizations to like impact the local economy. That's what we've been talking about, right? And this is what we were able to find. But how does that break down? Well, it breaks down like this. The Zoo Museum District accounts for about 41% of that $868.7 million. And you know that the Zoo Museum District is also publicly funded as of 1972. Now, the reason why that matters is because it didn't have to be that way. Like our zoo, the fact that we could just go into the zoo and be free, that's because, taxpayers paid for it, but that was a pretty hard slog. And that was back in 72, they kind of developed it there. About 39 arts and culture nonprofits make up 29% of that $868.7 million. So that's what we're gonna focus. As the ZMD's numbers are pretty transparent. They have audits. You can look at them anytime we want. But in terms of the 39 arts and cultural organizations that contribute to about 29% of this $868 billion, maybe not so much. And this is all based on what is called actually not even 868, it's actually 579. So the 579 is the exact expenditures of every arts organization. All right. The other money comes from what we believe to be spending from art audiences. And the last little maybe 10% that we'll highlight is from arts philanthropy. Arts philanthropy represents organizations like the Regional Arts Commission, but also organizations like Pransburg Arts Foundation, as well as others who might file what's called a 990 PF. That's for private foundations, right? So that's how this works. So about 23% of participants, there was like 233 organizations that participated in the Arts and Economic Prosperity Report. About 23% of those participants account for about 80% of the spending captured in AEPC. So 80% of that 579. Okay. That's a big deal. That speaks to, I would say, the disparities within the arts and culture sector, that so few can do so much. So what do these other organizations do? Well, I don't know. So we all move on. That's how little we know about it, because many of them file what's called a 990N. A 990N means that you spend less than $50,000, you receive less than $50,000, and so all you have to do is say that you exist. That's about it. But this is how it breaks down. That $868.7 million that I talked about, that you can see that in the industry totals column, and then audiences account for the $289 million. So how that worked is that me and a team of people went out into the community whenever we went to an arts event, and we asked people how much they spent. So that could be like bills before the event, bills after the event, bills during the event. Did you buy an outfit? Did you pay for childcare? Did you buy some gas? Whatever the case may be. Anything that's associated with that event, that goes into the audience category, the audience column. And again, I just mentioned, it talks about the $579.3 million from organizations. That comes from direct expenditures. And because AFTA is an advocacy organization, they bring in all this other stuff, which is full of it, for people who need to know. Like if you need to feel good about the arts contributing all this like tax revenue for local government, then great. One thing that is really important to note is this notion of this 289 million. So one of the things that we talk about is how local attendees account for about 6.5 million in terms of attendance, for a total of about 8.1 million attendees. The non-local is what we talk about a lot because in cultural tourism, the conversation is generally around how many dollars are we bringing into St. Louis that wasn't in St. Louis. That's what we talk about. But we see that largely, at least the events that we went to, that we surveyed at, it was populated mainly by these local attendees. Now, when we think about just those two things, these audience numbers of 8.1 million, that 8.1 million feeds into jobs, but you'll see that again. So in terms of contributions, I want us to kind of pay attention to looking at those 39 organizations. There's a black line. There's a black line there. What this black line gets into is two categories of money that organizations might report on their tax file: contributions and program revenue. Program revenue is typically associated with like ticket sales. Somebody sells some incense at an event, like we'll like sell incense because we need those dollars, all of them, right? So we might do that, and then we college has mission related because it's like selling cookies or whatever. It's just how we do. Now, real mission related stuff would be like tickets to a production at the Rap or at the Rap. Those ticket fees go into program revenue typically. Now, the other part is straight contribution. This would just be a donation. So if you look at that black line, what I did was I broke the 39 organizations into these broader categories of arts education, dance, theater, museum, non-ZMB, ZMB being the Zoom Museum issue, performing arts, media arts, music, visual arts. So I broke them down like that. And in terms of like performing arts, really we're talking about two organizations. Because unfortunately it's just 39 though, and that's right now. So the way this breaks down is that for this black line accounts for 100%. 100%. These organizations in 22, which was the year that we pulled our AEP data from, if they pulled together their contributions and their program revenues, they're not covering 100% of their costs. They're not covering it. So that was particularly difficult for the two performing arts agencies that are very distinct, so I couldn't really put them with anybody else. The visual arts agencies, organizations, they were able to cover 100% of their costs through just contributions alone. It's because that particular year ago was a pledge drive. There was a capital campaign for the music piece of it. Music being really broad. It's included classical music as well as more modern expressions of it. They were able to cover 100% of their costs through contributions alone. But again, you see other organizations that just get close enough to 100% coverage. So that means they have to find a different source. I mean, it would be like maybe interest earned on an endowment, if they have an endowment. They would have to find another bucket of money that isn't like ticket sales or earned revenue or contributions in order to make this work. I know this is all very dense, almost done. Now, I got a few more to go. Now, in St. Louis, you'll see the moment is that we have largely a gig economy when it comes to artists, but you see nationally, artists fall into this category of gig work. You see this touted by the U.S. Department of Commerce, specifically the census, because the census is a part of the Department of Commerce, and you see where the independent artists are, right? That 24.5 million, that's again considered gig work. Now, when you think about the arts, do you think about the arts as gig work? Maybe? Yep. No? Maybe you don't know the shit? I know, I've done gig work. I used to like throw phone books when they have phone books. That's gig work. That's a contract. I used to throw newspapers. That's gig work. That's a contract. And the rates are terrible. Oh, it's like 11 cents per rolled up newspaper. The reason why you're able to skirt like minimum wage laws is because of the independent contractor label. And it will see that a person could put in a ton of time, but not necessarily be paid at a rate that will be helpful to them. And so in St. Louis, we know that there are about 5,275 people who were artists, that identified as artists, who filed taxes in 2023. In the year that we're looking at, 2022, there were 5,212 who filed. Again, that's just IRS data. So the city-county divide pretty much looks like this. In 2022, we see there were far more people who filed in the county for their taxes than in the city, which was 1,600. Doesn't mean that there are more artists working. These are just the artists who are reporting, you know. And I know back in 2022, I was probably one of those artists that reported on their taxes for doing some sort of teaching artist work. Yeah. Shwana. HR report. So here are the receipts on artist revenue. So X amount of people filed, and this is the aggregate number of those receipts that they filed. In 2023, it looked like 103.7 million. In 2022, the year that we're looking at, is 98.6 million. Right? That's a lot, you know? That's a lot. But what does that really break down to? That breaks down to roughly about, so here we have the city-county divide. So for the city, they're both down to about 19,000. For the county, they're both down to about, for the county, they're both down to about 19,000. For the city, go down to about 17,000, right? And you just do the math from there. The reason why you kind of break it down that way is not because people are actually trying to stretch out 19,000 over the year. Most artists just get paid a contract for a particular period of work, and then they just go on about the business. But if we were to try to stretch it out over the year, what we see is that that's insufficient. It's not enough money to cover expenses.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Where you have the receipts slide up there, are those deductions? Is that what that is?
Yeah. So do you have are you do any consulting work or contract work?
Yeah.
So you know that part where you talk about how much you earn from your contract work. That's what that is.
Okay.
That's what that.
Thanks.
Sure. And again, like I said, it breaks down to about a total of about 18,000 for 2022. For 2023, 19,000. If we were to do that like on an annual basis, right? So looking at the same data set for 2022, we see that orgs likely paid about $63.2 billion on freelance workers. Now this is going into the 990 pretty deep. There's a page, is like page 9. And what it gets into, while like a matrix of costs, in this cost matrix, there's a column that says programs. And in the columns, in the column section, there is a line item that gets into the very specific cost of contracts. So these were like people who aren't actually employed by the organization, but instead they receive, they pay out to these different individuals, and it came to about 63.2 million. So that's great data from as many organizations that actually follow 990. I had to look at that. So in St. Louis, we have over 600 organizations that are categorized as cultural. Over 600, close to about 664 organizations come in and out of existence all the time. But the 600 the 63.2 million, rather, the 63.2 million may not actually be from only artists, but again, think about the broader art world. These are all people who are in support of those forms and those parties. So even though this might be somebody who does, let's just say, again, carpentry work for a gallery, we know that their carpenter is really important to a gallery. If you don't have a nice wall on which to hang or installation that might also be done by a carpenter, you won't have a good looking exhibition. That's a very important part of the conversation. Just put your art on some trash walls. It won't work. It'll look like, you know, you're not serious. And it also look like they don't care about you. Like the gallery doesn't care about you. All right. So unfortunately, there's no available data on the number of artist workers except for IDS. And this is what this IDS data is. This is that. As non-employer, that's non-employer statistics. All right, so if we can do a thought experiment with me for a bit here, NES data about 98.6 million in 2022. If we minus the org's contribution, which is about 63.2 million, that means that we have roughly about $35 million for the accounted for in terms of different organizations that or entities that might have paid dues. We know that musicians from Sound Diplomacy, another report that the Regional Arts Commission supported, we know that Sound Diplomacy talked a lot about how there were musicians who did not give specifically for and with nonprofit music organizations. So that means that they were gigging for profits, you know. And for-profits but they don't account for how they spend their money necessarily. So that means that the only way we can get at that is through the non-employer statistics, which is all the tax filings of those individual musicians who have contract work. But if we do that, we know that there's about 35 billion. In addition to that, this 98.6 million of the 868 million, that is, we think about it, you know, there's roughly about 11% was possibly spent on artists in the 2022 gig economy. Again, Play was doing this thought experiment, right? So this is putting AEP 6 data in relationship with the NES data that I just talked about. We know that the gig economy might be roughly about 11% of that, 868 billion. And the reason why this is important is because we're talking about $868.7 million a lot. So what does it actually mean? And for a moment, I didn't really have a good answer for that. Like, so what? All these organizations contributed 868.7, not organizations, but all these people, it's the whole industry, both organizations and the people contributed this $868.7 million. What does that mean for the individual artists? Well, what that means is that's about the size of the gig economy in 2022, based on that 868. And that's understated, because we know that organizations are doing work, they're just not necessarily reporting their work. Of the 5,212 people who filed, and the 11,986 people whose work has been supported by this industry, sports industry of both arts organizations and the audiences that support, we can kind of come to a rough calculation of about 43% of the jobs supported were in fact gig economy jobs. So when AEP is talking about or shows that there was X amount of jobs that were supported, if we had to come up with a rough estimate and guesstimate based on some real data, it looks like 43% of that economy was in support of the gig economy. This is important. Again, the importance of it speaks more so to how we imagine the work of the artist looks today, right? Not all of them are struggling artists, but I tell you what, there are artists who are not necessarily being paid an adequate sum, especially for their contributions to the region. Rough estimates continue. So in 2023, RAC, in partnership with Americans for the Arts, reported that 868 million. And for methodological reasons, we might break it down in very different ways. But again, us putting this data together helps us to understand some basic stuff. So or direct spending was 579 million for a possible salary. This is how they calculated, of about 42,000 But if we look at the NES data, the non-employer statistic data, the data that people are reporting to the IRS, that breaks down to about 19,000 for that same year. And what do we know? We know that according to the living wage calculator, that to live in St. Louis after taxes get about $37,000. AEP 6 shows us that the contribution to the sector looks like 42,000. And remember, some of the data I'm not even reporting because it comes out of the ZMD. So the NES data, though, which is without regard to like the source, whether it was ZMD or the arts and cultural organizations or whatever the case may be, comes to about 19,000, which is not a living wage. In the couple of minutes I have left, I'm going to run down a couple of things of this. It's from our Creators Count report, which you can find on the RAC website, as well as the AEP data you will find on the RAC website as well. Bottom line to it, this is the ranking of where the dollars have been coming from, a little bit of information. So we're the Regional Arts Commission, back in 2023, we gave as much as $1 million to individual artists. Which is not through the organization, and of course continue to give to organizations. The Missouri Arts Council is up there, maybe because of their giving to organization, or it might be because of contracts, because they don't necessarily do direct grants to individual artists. Washington University, contracts. Kransberg Arts Foundation. If you done any work with the Kransberg Arts Foundation, yeah, contracts, right? Yeah, it's all work. It's work. Arts Education Council, contracts, or maybe some kind of direct grant, but not really. The Luminary, if you got that Luminary grant, right? And if you got nothing, you don't. But anyways, this is a small pile of money there, but some artists, man, but to benefit from that, and it kind of goes on. Paycheck protections, because we were coming out of the pandemic. Arctica, as an organization, they would provide honoraria for people who participated in their work, so on and so forth. Also, where we are, University of Missouri St. Louis, we see that at least the mentions, in terms of the mentions, by artists who were surveyed during this count, talks about getting some money from University of Missouri St. Louis. So there's some basic RAC applicant data. So RAC used to collect a lot of data, but because of the shifts in our ecosystem where we need to make it easier for organizations to access dollars, a lot of those questions went away. But for the questions that we were able to ask and the information I was able to glean from it, we got data from about 1 to 16 arts organizations with expenditures that range from about $6,000 to about $30 million. And the reason why that matters is because the $6,000, those are people who would just file a 990-N. We wouldn't be able to see any of the data, from the tax and such, tax filers of organizations. Only 6 reported paying $0. Everyone else reported paying up to about $19.5 million. So the average local artist composition range from the gig honorarium of $23, if you want to do the math, to a performance of about $54 for a performance, so about $54,000 for a year. So the organizations that are strong, that are robust, are able to do the $54,000. The smaller organizations, small like festivals, we're talking about gigs, but thank you for coming through, $23. And that's the share, the biggest share coming from classical music. So they're able to give out a lot of that money. Aggregate employment by STL org spending, $500. This is an important idea to consider, that every organization, if they so choose, will likely add how many people were employed at their organization for that given fiscal year. Now, some organizations don't, but they report compensation. I don't know why they do that. That's weird. How do you have compensation but you don't report jobs? But some of them not. Anyways, so this number is likely a bit understated, but we see what the jobs picture looks like, and we see that there was a significant dip in 2021. I suspect these like all the jobs that were shared in 2021 were the hit jobs. There's just like they just stuck with people that they absolutely needed. Now some of them could have been gig workers as well or contract workers as well, but anybody who was not essential in 2021 to an organization's operation, they probably did not have a contract rate for help. But then it started to build back up, and again, when we see this building back up, we're likely seeing more gig work. Once we start getting better data around the number of actual full-time and part-time employees, people who actually receive some sort of benefit from the organization from working there, we can draw a clearer picture of contract workers versus employees. But until that time, this is what we got. Some additional information from previous counting again, you can check this out on the RAC website. We see the breakdown. We know that largely the support for artists comes from the household, because there may not be other sources independent of the household or for gig work that will help them allow them to do their creative practice. We see that much of the barriers, and you'll see some of this work with Dr. Klein a bit, but we see that a lot of the barriers for them might be that they don't have enough financial resources in order to do what they want to do. What best describes how you pursue your primary practice? So I pursue my creative practice as the owner or co-owner of a business. That would be the non-employee statistic I talked about, the NES data. I do freelance work again, the NES data. And we see essentially all respondents, but wish to follow up as characterize your paid work outside of the arts. Full-time work, because they got to be able to pay for this stuff. Temporary gig work is the green. A couple other things, and then I'm going to rack this thing up and hand it off into Dr. Kwan. Employment and wage data for STL, MSA. This is all from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. You can see what it looked like over these periods of time, whether it was 2018, 2021, 2024. Again, for me, this is about triangulation. Like, how many of these data points actually line up? Like, how close are we getting it? You know, how right could this possibly be? So these numbers just help me better understand what the reporting is. And this particular report comes from business owners or nonprofits that employ people. So these are what the managers would say or the HR person would say about how many employees are in that business that they pay. So the other stuff was self-reported from the artists. This is reported from the employers. I'm going to skip to this one. Program revenue is proxy for market share. I talked earlier about how the program revenue category helps us understand maybe how much earned revenue an organization was able to receive. We see that a lot of program revenue comes from the theater world, which makes sense because that's tickets. Program revenue also is pretty healthy for the dance world. But if we aggregate all of those program revenues, this is what the share looks like. So if we aggregate it, the share of it looks like 64% is theater, music, and that shows you how little nonprofit music organizations make an impact in our local economy. That's 5%. There are several orchestras, not just one. Several operas, not just one. But you can see that the money that they get from ticket sales isn't necessarily a big part of their business. The biggest part of their business is contributions. Whereas with dance, that's a challenge because they don't necessarily receive a lot of contributions and they don't necessarily earn a lot of revenue. So a few takeaways. ABC captures the level of arts and cultures related spending for the St. Louis area. Even strong wards are at risk of not maintaining consistent spending levels. And if they're not able to maintain the spending levels, that means that people weren't getting paid as much the next year. We saw that drop off in 2021 with a slowly, building back of it. Costs associated with paying gig workers appear to be increasing more sharply than the number of participants in the gig economy. One of the things that's really interesting is that if you I created a chart for it, but it would be better to see like a line graph. Essentially, there's a sharper increase for the amount of money that people are claiming on receipts than the number of people who are actually filing taxes. So that suggests that people are getting paid more in the last couple of years. That post-pandemic, artist workers are getting paid more. For artists, largely big economy in St. Louis. Average wage is below living wage. Gig opportunities appear loosely tied to expense levels reported by exempt entities. So the point is that if you have an exempt entity that's reporting expenses, and of course part of the expense are salaries or compensation, as they go, the amount of money that's reported in the gig economy does not go in the same direction. They don't have a positive relationship. At times it can be a bit inverse, which suggests that the nonprofit arts and culture sector is only a piece of the puzzle for helping us to understand how artists get paid. There is a much bigger piece out there that we've got to detect that helps us understand how much people get paid, or that the organizations that don't report a 990 or 990 EZ or giving dollars to artists, but because they're not heavily featured in the report or we're not able to use those numbers, we can't determine with any certainty if the nonprofit sector is carrying the full weight of the community of individual artists. So it seems like there's a diversion there. There's something else out there that's up for artists, and we have to figure that thing out so that we can mass amplify that. Gig workers, again, reporting a higher amounts of money than they use. So that's it. That's my time. Any questions that you might have, we can entertain those at the end. And thank you very much. And now for Dr. Paul.
Well, thank you all for your patience. This always happens actually. At the beginning of every semester, they just don't work right. It takes a little bit of time. So what I was saying before was that MK's presentation provides a kind of a bird's eye view of the art sector, or the arts and culture sector as it looks. My approach, since I am a cultural anthropologist, is a bit different. I have tried to understand the lives of these creative artists themselves through their words. Right. And also you notice from MK's data that a lot of the data is not disaggregated by race. So my research project is really focused on trying to understand young Black creatives. Right. How do they think about the world? How do they think about what they do? Right. And so part of the motivation for this project came from the Creatives Cup that MK mentioned. The Creatives Cup was published in 2023. It was a quantitative survey of creatives or artists in the region, right? There were a couple of questions, I think, that were raised from the Creatives Cup. And two, I think, that really struck my mind when I read it, is that why do young Black creators identified as entrepreneurs? Right? Why is their understanding of who they are, their creative practice as entrepreneurs? Right? And then how do they perceive the arts ecosystem itself? Do they engage or do they not engage? Right? And this kind of information, I think you can only really get at by actually talking to a lot of Black creators. And also that you notice is that the Creatives Cult, I think they did a very good job of doing outreach to communities to be able to get a larger sample, but unfortunately, I think Black creators were underrepresented, and which is not unusual for quantitative survey data, period. Right. Now, the difference between quantitative and qualitative, again, my focus is on looking at where they think and live, right? And so that means that I'm going to sacrifice generalizability for more intimacy and greater depth. The static method. I focused on youth, 18 to 34, and there's a reason for that. I wanted to understand how young Black creators were being socialized into the creative sector and how we were thinking about how they're developing their careers, right? Now, while I was doing that, I discovered that we needed a comparison, and here that we started interviewing 35-year-olds, and older creators, partly because we needed to understand historical context. How has the creative sector changed over time? And what is the endpoint for a creative career for Black creatives in St. Louis? Like, do they stay in? Do they leave? Or do they just give up? Right? So I think these are some of the larger questions that we needed to figure out. So collected about 200 hours of interviews, and that turned into about 5,000 pages of transcribed text, which I then had to analyze, which took way too much time. It is an ongoing process, right? That you're really never really done, right? So what I'm going to do here today is to give you a bit of demographic data to get a better sense of who these are. And one of the things that we do know from an academic perspective is that we don't know very much about yellow Black people in general. But we have a lot of stereotypes. Even academics, we tend to focus too much on what we consider quote-unquote troubled or at-risk youth. And we don't really pay much attention to, I think, the vast majority of youth who are just struggling to make equal livelihoods. That data is something that's very missing. This is something that I wanted to address. Correct. Now, as a qualitative research, again, I want you to understand that this is not generalizable to the entire Black grade population in the St. Louis region, right? But it should give us a sense of understanding of who these people are, right? Now, gender and sexuality. I should have done much more. It wasn't part of my original analysis, but I think it came up to be something very critical for us to understand the creative sector as a whole. Right. And what we see is that Black creatives who identify as queer are burdened by both their identification by gender and sexuality as well as being Black. Right? They are having to navigate both. So, for example, this is a quote from the visual artist, and there are very few spaces in which queer Black artists, creators, can be openly themselves in any situation, right? If they are in Black spaces, oftentimes they have to then conceal their queer aspects of who they are. When they are in queer spaces, then they have to then kind of push back their Black aspects of who they are. Right, so they're constantly navigating that. Race, I think, is another really interesting thing, and we think that race is so evident, but it's not, right? A lot of people ask what does it mean to be Black, right? And you begin to see that Black identity is much more complicated than we think it is, right? And so here, partly, we can identify what it means to be, for example, biracial, right? But also those who, quote-unquote, identify as biologically Black also struggle with Black identity. So to give you an example, if you are a young Black creative who grew up in predominantly white spaces and went to a white school district, their stories tell us that they struggle with what it means to be Black, right? So cultural context really matters in the way that they think about who they are and how they navigate those kinds of spaces, right? The creative discipline. What's interesting here is that the creative count showed that there were more visual artists than music artists. My research, and maybe this is an issue of my own sampling process, but that we found that more of the people that I talked with identified as a part of the music sector. Now, at the same time, when we say that they are part of the music discipline, it doesn't actually specify what they actually do. For example, you could be a singer, right? You could be a producer, songwriter, instrumentalist, right? It's much more complicated than that. But what we find is that from the research is that there's very few creatives who identify with one singular discipline, right? They identify as multiple. Right. Now, in terms of their training, what's interesting is that the vast majority say that they were self-taught. And so we have to understand what does that actually mean. And what we begin to see that is probably related to a lack of resources, right? And a lack of opportunities for professional development. And also the ad hoc way that a lot of creatives are actually developing their careers, right? It's not like they're going to a performing arts school, but just be trained to become a professional, right? It's start, stop, learn, look here, little, up there, right? That's the general process. Okay. Now, class, I think, is something that we don't talk enough about. And why is that? And part of this is, of course, is that we know that in terms of opportunity, that one's parents or guardians' class study matters, right? It deeply shapes the decisions that we make and the opportunities that we have. What we found from my research here is that the vast majority, however, identify as middle class of some kind, lower, middle, upper, right? Now, why is that? And what I'm focusing on here is not the fact that they are actually lower middle class, upper middle class. It's about self-identification, which means how do they see themselves, right, relative to others around them, right? And what we also see is that when you think about class, it's not simply an economic identity, that in fact it is a moral identity. And especially when they're talking about, and questions that I would ask about their class background, is really about how were they raised? What did their parents do? And what we find from their stories, right, is that many of them did struggle, right? People told me stories about bouts of homelessness. People told me stories about having to live with relatives in different places. People talked about quite often, actually, power being out, right? Not having hot water, quote unquote, taking bird baths because they didn't have access, right? But at the same time, while they were talking about some of their struggles the parents went through, right? They also talked about how much they respected their parents, their guardians, their grandparents, right? And the fact that they were able to hide that, they really didn't know that they had poor lives, right? And I think that's something really interesting, the way that young Black people in general, but here's specifically the young Black creators, right, see their place in the world, and that the amount of respect that they have for the people who have raised them. And here this is a top line. And God, I think it says a lot. So another way to think about class, of course, is geography, right? And what we see from the research is that the vast majority grew up in predominantly Black neighborhoods. Now, given the history of this region, right, where you live indicates or indexes, and not exactly, for there are variations, generally your race and class positioning in society. Now, what's important here is that when we think about race and class and their intersection, it's important to understand, and what I'm trying to point here is that Black poverty is not the same as white poverty. Because of geography, right? Because that the research shows, right, that, for example, middle-class African Americans are more likely to live closer to poorer communities and poorer neighborhoods than their white counterparts, right? Meaning that they'll have less access to resources, regardless of how much they're actually making, right? And that is a history. The story that I was hearing that is not necessarily about class identity per se. It's about, I think, childhood instability, right? That people move in and out of households. People move in and out of class status, right? And we need to understand that how does that affect the way that they approach their creative lives, right? And the slide here demonstrates, right, that middle-income Black and Hispanic families are more likely to experience valuable mobility. And there are clear reasons for that. One, of course, is the history of segregation, discrimination, and the job market, right? The inability to amass wealth, right? Housing, things like that. The other thing, however, is also about parenting. So what we get to see that from my research and also from the national statistical data is that a large number were raised by what we might call a single parent. That could either be a biological step-parent, guardian, grandparent, or a combination thereof, right? Now, why is this important? We understand that vast majority of single parents tend to be women, right? And we also know that the women experience tremendous discrimination. And so that also makes single parent households much more vulnerable to economic misfortune, right? And so from the data here, we find that a lot of my participants were raised by a single parent or grandparent. Yeah. Now, I raised this point, and I was looking through this data, and then I did really contextualize per se, right? Because I'm not here to reproduce any of the stereotypes. A part of this is that this idea of the myth of the types of black eye, right? But what we do know from the research that actually exists, and the CDC research that came out earlier, shows that among co-residential fathers, it's actually black fathers are much more involved with their children's raising that either they're white or Hispanic fathers. Right? And given all of the challenges, right, that we have just described relative to who these young black creators are for the St. Louis region, what we also see is something I found really fascinating, is that all but two had at least college education, right? That can be a community college, that can be a for-profit college, but they aspire to more than high school. And why I mention that is because it breaks a lot of the stereotypes that we have that black communities do not value education. What we see is that families are striving to provide as much education as possible, and their children also aspire to the same. The question then is, why are they not able to complete college? Right? What are the reasons? And I think those reasons are, I think I can make a bit more clear, right? So given that we provided a kind of a broad picture of who these people are, there are a couple major themes from a creators call that I wanted to address. And that is entrepreneurship is the first one, and then of black creative networks. Now, why do young black creatives overwhelmingly identify as entrepreneurs? Now, again, the creators count did not disaggregate the data. For you know, what they state is that BIPOC in general identify more, but from my research, black respondents overwhelmingly identify as entrepreneurs. So, at the time, I'm going to kind of stick through the employment thing. And I think the way we think about this is that entrepreneurship is related to a particular kind of black identity, right? And what could you think about entrepreneurship and black identity? To think about it structurally and looking at what is happening. And so MK mentioned that we live in a gig economy, which means that oftentimes build and structurally must see themselves as entrepreneurs, right? They have to go out and gig. But I think there's something more there, right? And part of that, I think, is that an entrepreneurial identity also confers upon people a certain kind of moral identity or respectability, right? And what we get to see then that a lot of the black creators I talk to, when they say that they are an entrepreneur, they're not saying that they are only like a business. They're saying that they themselves are the business, right? And there, I quote that JC line from a Kanye West song, but I think it makes a lot of sense because that is told to me over and over again, right? I am the brand. I am the business, right? So it's interesting if you think about it in those terms, that does that mean that we have to rethink what it means to be creative in the 21st century, right? If that is the case, then how can we support black creatives, all right? And quite possibly we need to begin to think about support not as providing grant money, but perhaps think about it in terms of business incubation. So I think it's going to be a very different way to approach it. Right. Now, as I said, that being an entrepreneur provides a kind of a moral identity. Respect is something that comes up over and over again. Now, of course, this idea of respect, right, has a very long history. Right? We have to go back to, Booker T. Washington and his ideas of racial uplift. Can talk about Du Bois. You talk about a number of Black leaders who really saw entrepreneurship as a way to hold on to and gain respect. And I think we see very similar things here. But I think it has a little slightly different ring in a way, because they also, Black people, talk about freedom. And so we have to wonder then, so like when a white or Asian person says, I want to be entrepreneur because I want to be free to do things that I care about, I think it rings quite differently when you hear from Black people in general, and specifically the Black creatives, right? It's not simply what we hear about laws, right? Controlling their own times. And I think it's really about opportunity. That the story that I hear about what they talk about being an entrepreneur is about, it tells stories about how challenging it is to be in right spaces, to be in right schools, part of Black institutions, to work in white controlled occupations, right? And there is a tremendous amount of emotional, psychological toll, right? And so the question that is, what can I do for my own well-being so that I can be myself, so that I don't have the code switch in the workplace, right? These are quotes from a young Black woman who identifies very strongly as an entrepreneur, right? But she also has a full-time job, right? But she developed an entrepreneurial career. And as she tells it, right, it is challenging to be in some of these spaces, right? And so this is one of the reasons I would argue that so many young Black creatives identify as entrepreneurs, is that it is the way that they can then focus on their well-being, right? And again, for some of us who have seen others or who ourselves have code switch in these types of spaces, it wears on you, right? It takes a toll. And entrepreneurship, I think, provides an escape from that. The other part is when you're identifying as an entrepreneur, is to say that I not only claim respect, that I want you to treat me with respect. And that's treat me simply as someone who is creative, right? And people ask me to do things for free, right? I want you to treat me as an entrepreneur. That means I want a contract and I want to be paid what I'm worth, right? I think that's also a part of your self-identification. Any questions? And yes, if you have any questions, just so that I'm not simply lecturing here, I do that way too much. So if you have any questions, just raise your hand, let it up. The other thing is, the importance of Black creative balance. And given time, I'm going to rush through this a little bit. But there is this really interesting thing that people say a lot in English. It's like, it's a really small, big city. And it's kind of like crabs in a bucket. So I was wondering, what does that mean, crabs in a bucket? And this idea that, and it's interesting here so often, that in these interviews, they said, Black people here hold each other down rather than lift each other up. And so I said, now, is that true? Now, as a social scientist, I can't just take that regret. I need to go do some research. But what I applied to this, it's too complicated. Because what you find is that people do support each other. What we do find is that people do move from different groups, right? And it's not as challenging as people make it out to be. There are plenty of stories of people just, for example, here is a young Black female queer hip-hop artist, right? And as she's developing her career, she said, you know what, Paul? How do you do it? I said, I just showed up. And you just keep by showing up, right? And you begin to find that by showing up that people begin to support you. Now, why I think this is important, this requires additional research, is that I think it is the way to think about that there is a growing understanding amongst Black creatives and perhaps amongst African Americans as a whole, especially, amongst our groups, of an idea of mutual aid. And I think that there is a very subtle, I would almost say, a social movement of young Black creatives, young Black artists, or Black activists, really thinking about how they support each other, right? So that idea of crabs in a bucket may be there, but I think that it is not as clear that that actually exists here. Right. Again, it refers to a lot more research for us. Now, what I can say in terms of the crabs in the bucket mentality, right? In terms of the idea of these kind of exclusive groups, this idea of gatekeeping, is that this is happening probably at a more structural level, meaning that Black creative networks are predominantly Black, and Black creatives do not spend much time in either racially mixed or white networks. So what does this suggest, right? Black creatives are relying on other Black creatives, right? For economic support, for emotional support, for opportunities, right? Now, of course, this shouldn't surprise us. The data is also very clear. Not only do we live in a very segregated city, the entire nation is quite segregated. But the research also is very clear that most people's social networks are racially homogeneous, right? And what's interesting is that research is that white people tend to have the most homogeneous social networks. Now, the question here then is, do Black creative networks have as much access to resources as the white social networks? And that clearly is not the case. Again, going back to the history of segregation here, right? And when we begin to see that social spatial segregation is deeply related to, of course, the social segregation and that the desegregation of these Black creative networks. And given this history, what people actually hold in terms of resources and wealth are, again, quite unequal. So this is, I think, we could think about in terms of racial gatekeeping, right? Now, what's interesting here is that racial gatekeeping, the way that I am conceptualizing it, doesn't require intention, right? It is built into the structures that we have. So if you grew up in predominantly Black neighborhoods, which predominantly Black schools, right? White folks in the county going to predominantly white neighborhoods, going around the white schools. What are the opportunities for them to actually come together and mix? Right? There just isn't much. Any questions about this?
What? Yeah, sure. That is part of your presentation. Thoughts on, what we can do to better support.
Oh yes. Oh yeah. Oh, I have a bunch of recommendations. I'll bury it. So again. Oh, I see. You had a question?
Yeah, I wanted to know what the racial homogeneity in regards to other modular components, such as like queerness. As you said previously, that where people are kind of oscillating between queer spaces and Black spaces, and then so you can really.
Yes, that's a fantastic question, and I'll just say that unfortunately that it is not. I did do not research that, right? And again, like everyone had to blind spots. And I have to admit that this was a blind spot when I designed this project. And that I come to realize that this is something that has to be done. That we need to study how queerness works in these Black communities, right? And to need some more of that to understand what is actually happening. So, Master, you want to work this new fast? Right? The other really important question that came out of the Creators Cause is people's awareness of, the arts ecosystem as a whole. And why part of Black creatives, young Black creatives especially, engaging with or writing grants, right? Especially given data is showing very clearly that young Black creatives or Black creatives or BIPOC creatives as a whole are not faring as well economically. They need more financial support. So why aren't they applying for grants? One of the issues I think is that related to what we have been talking about. One, there's a lack of awareness of the idea of art ecosystem as a whole. They are not aware of a lot of these institutions outside of the major ones that people in general know, right? And relate to this, again, is idea here, and this is where we could get a little academic, is to talk about the idea of cultural capital, right? What is cultural capital? The easiest way for me to think about it is like cultural competency, a set of ways of habits of being, right? Habits of speaking, talking, right? Dressing, the way that we act, right? The question then is, where do we learn them? We learn these competencies where we grow up, in our neighborhoods, our families, our schools. But what happens when we live in such a segregated society, right? That the cultural capital that one population has learned is very different from the cultural capital of another population. Now, what's interesting about the idea of cultural capital is that it functions as parental, meaning that the cultural capital of certain people are valued more than the cultural capital of others. The currency is just valued more, right? And so we could be to think about that if you go and work in specific kinds of institutions. What is the cultural capital that is valued there? And what we find, of course, is that the cultural capital that many young Black creators have developed is not as valued in this place. And this goes back to the other question, right? About, this idea